Who holds political power in your community? Do you? And by political power, I mean who makes decisions about stuff in your community? Who makes decisions about how resources are used, how your community gets built, and the rules that govern your community? Do you? If we live in a democratic society, the answer is supposed to be yes. It should be, yes, I have political power. Yes, I make decisions about my community. But most of us, faced with those questions, that's not how we answer. We're not sure how to answer those questions, or at best, we're uncertain. That's a problem. We have been fighting wars, people have been dying, for at least 350 years. Some would say for longer, trying to put in place basic democratic principles. Things like the rule of law, one person, one vote, universal suffrage, freedom of speech, an independent judiciary. People have fought and died for this stuff. In many parts of the world, people are still fighting and dying for this stuff. And yet I ask the question, do you have political power? Do you make decisions about our community? And our response is, I don't know, maybe. To make matters worse, when it comes to democracy, in many ways we actually seem to be doing worse. There's a very ugly form of populism and nationalism rising up in different parts of the world, declining voter turnout at all levels of government, studies showing declining levels of trust not only in elected officials, but government institutions themselves. Recently, I spoke at the end of a conference. There was about 70 people in the room. It was a mix of Canadians and Americans. And I asked, how many people here feel good about democracy? How many hands do you think went up? Not one hand went up. And I'm pretty sure they were awake. It looked like they were not asleep. Not one hand went up. So obviously, we need to do better. The question is how? I believe that part of our challenge is how we've come to understand political decision-making. When it comes to making decisions about our communities, we've come to rely on two approaches: voting and elected representatives. Those are two very specific, very particular ways to do democracy, to share political power, to make decisions about our communities. And by understanding decision-making only in those two ways, going to the ballot box, elected representatives, we're holding ourselves back. We're holding ourselves back from finding new and different ways to engage as political citizens. Let me ask you, when you imagine a democratic community, what do you picture? What does that actually look like? Is it voting? Let's try out the voting thing right now as a way to make decisions all of the time. Let's suppose that in order to go have lunch, we all need to decide what to eat. So show of hands if for lunch you would like to have a burger and fries. Show of hands. All right. And show of hands if you would prefer to have quinoa salad. Oh my goodness, some cheers and a lot more hands. All right, I got news for you. That's what we're all having for lunch. We're all having quinoa salad. Hopefully no one was keen on the burger and fries. Is that really the best way to make a decision? This may come as a shock. Voting is not the only way to do democratic decision-making. I believe we need to go beyond voting, beyond elected representatives. Now, that exercise we did was ridiculous for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is the absurd notion that the preferences of this entire room can be captured and represented by two options. So we need to do better. The question is how. One place we can look to for inspiration is a place often credited for many of our democratic practices. But rather than talk about Athenian or Greek democracy generally, I want to talk about specifically something that happened here, a place called the Nix. This is a gathering place in Athens. It overlooks the Acropolis. 2,500 years ago, the Athenians tried something here that was radical. They put in place a practice whereby any male citizen who wanted to participate in and discuss the issues being put forward for a decision could simply show up. They could just show up here and participate. They didn't have to be from a particular family. They didn't have to be elected. They didn't even have to register in advance. The first 6,000 to show up here got to participate. How they sorted through that's another story. Now, we need to do better than that. We need to do much better, because in that practice, they only went so far as to include male citizens, and they don't get a pass for that. They knew better. There were writers and philosophers writing at the time about the need to include women, the notion of abolishing slavery, the need to include other residents of the Athenian population in practices like this, and they chose not to. So we have to do way better than them. But that idea they put in place, that anybody can just show up, was radical, and it's simply the premise or the concept that when it comes to making decisions about our communities, about our political lives, we all get to participate. And the only thing we need to do to participate is show up. It's the only requirement. So I've been working in the nonprofit community sector most of my life and thinking about what community decision-making looks like today. And one place I drew inspiration from is an experience that happened to me here. Another very exciting picture of gravel and rocks. This is a gravel parking lot. And this is in a community in British Columbia that was sorely lacking when it came to sport and recreation activities for kids and youth. There was a community of people here who had an idea for this place. And by taking democracy into their own hands, they were able to achieve something that was incredible. So I believe we need to go beyond voting, beyond elected representatives, start looking for and finding democracy in our personal lives, in our communities. And then we need to make it awesome. And I'm going to talk about both those things. In order to do that, the first thing we need is a different definition of democracy. So I've thought long and hard about this, and I have a new, very complicated, very technical definition. Are you ready? It's like years of study to go into this. The thing is, when this happens, when groups of people get together and make decisions as political equals, some powerful things happen. People learn from one another. They challenge one another. They come up with new and different ideas. Rather than be stuck with the decision between burger and fries, quinoa salad, they decide to hold a potluck or a buffet or go for pizza. I'm perfectly timed before lunch. This is good. The challenge, though, becomes, if this is going to be democracy, where are we going to do that? There's over 30 million people in Canada. There's a lot of people in the world. How are we going to set this up so the groups of people can get together and make decisions about stuff? The exciting thing is, this already exists on a huge scale. Nonprofit community organizations are governed and directed by groups of people making decisions about stuff. And for the most part, they're volunteers who've simply decided to arrive. They've just decided to show up. And if you consider across Canada, there are 180,000 nonprofits, you assume an average board size of 10, you potentially have 1.8 million people doing community democracy right now. This already exists on a huge scale. And the scope of this sector is unbelievable. It's everything from a community people planning a community garden, community center association that holds a community carnival in order to gather feedback about what the new playground should look like. It's everything from an arts and cultural group with no paid staff who puts on a festival every year, parent advisory group, provincial and national professional associations, university clubs, student clubs, the people who put on this conference. Here in Vancouver, the YVR Airport is a nonprofit. So if you think back to the first question I asked, who makes decisions about how the rules that govern your community, how your community gets built, and the resources, how the resources in your community are used, this sector is also scaled in a way that could have an impact on all of those things. And if you remember that gravel parking lot, this is a 20,000 square foot gymnastics and sports center. The vision for this, the idea for this, was put forward by the community. It's currently operated by a nonprofit society. 2,000 kids between the ages of 6 months and adults go through programs in this space. The community made it happen. And it had nothing to do with voting. It had nothing to do with elected representatives. So hopefully at this point, you're starting to think of a place in your life where decision-making happens, where there's groups of people getting together to make decisions about something happening in your community. When I said nonprofits, you may also have been thinking of that last board or committee meeting you participated in that dragged on till midnight, or the ugly politics that can sometimes happen in nonprofits. So our first challenge, and those are absolutely challenges, our first task is to find democracy in our lives in communities. and the communities where we live and work already. Our second challenge is to make it awesome. And here's how we make it awesome. Go and find people who want to participate in the things that you're making decisions about. There are no rules about who to include and how to include people in the decision-making of a nonprofit. Every group of people can decide who they're going to include and how they're going to do it. Hold a community carnival, hold a block party, set up a booth at the Farmers Festival. Go out and find people and make it easy for them to participate. This, again, is a place where we need to go beyond. We need to do way better than the Athenians, who simply invited male citizens to come. We need to go and find people and make it easy for them to participate. And nonprofits, you've got no rules. You can do that however you want, and you can make it fun and exciting. Get outside of the boardroom. Once you are together, co-create the agenda. And as I've outlined here, this is a really big deal to me. When we think of democratic decision-making, we focus on the final decision. We tend not to think about who created the agenda in the first place. It's why we're so frustrated with referendums and plebiscites, because we didn't pose the question. We didn't set the agenda. It's why a government ministry, in deciding to put a highway through a community, can say, yeah, we did a completely democratic exercise. We asked residents to choose the color of the retaining wall. Complete democracy. In some sense, that's true, but in another sense, it's not. No one wanted to talk about the retaining wall. They wanted to talk about the highway, but they didn't control the agenda. And that exercise previously, I gave you no choice of what the menu options were. Not only that, I didn't even tell you what was on the agenda before I forced you to vote. Think about the agenda, who created it, and who's participating. And the form this takes is in that question that appears on every single committee and board meeting agenda in the world. Do you have anything to add to the agenda? Does everyone approve the agenda? We put that on every meeting agenda, but we skip over it. We don't think about it. Stop there. Pause. Decide what to decide. What do we need to be talking about? In fact, your next meeting, throw your agenda in the garbage, grab a blank piece of paper, hand it around, say, everybody, okay, write down what is the most important thing for us to talk about right now. That becomes your agenda. That meeting will be the most powerful, engaging meeting you've ever had as a group. Tell stories, learn, and reflect from one another. Hear the perspectives and the challenges of the individuals participating in the group where you're working together. Have entire meetings where you don't decide anything, where you're just there to listen. We heard earlier about listening with curiosity and patience. Make time to do that. This may come as no surprise for me. Try to avoid voting. Gauge support instead. Community democracy makes it possible to gauge support and move forward on a consensus basis instead. If you're a group of 10 and you've got 2 people who are really opposed to a decision moving forward, maybe stop and pause. Is there more information you need? Do you need to go back to the agenda creation stage and see if there's an agenda item that was missed? Use a scale from 1 to 10. 10 complete support, 1 is completely opposed. If a couple people in the group are at a 4 or 5, maybe that's sufficient consent to proceed. If one person in your group is at a 1, maybe you need to stop and go back to listening. Find someone in your group, your organization, to hold accountable. So partner up with someone who you're going to support and you're going to hold accountable to moving forward with the decisions that they made, putting forward the ideas that the group came up with. Community democracy makes this possible. When was the last time you felt accountable and responsible for a decision you made at the ballot box? In community democracy, we're typically expected to follow through with the things we say we're going to do. So find a partner and support them in doing that. Lastly, as a group, talk about your process. Talk about what's working well in your decision-making. Talk about what's not working. And make changes. Be willing to make changes with how you work together, how you make decisions together. So my challenge to you, go and find some place in your community where groups of people are making decisions about stuff. And your next meeting, your next get-together, try one of these things. Just imagine if our decisions at the ballot box were informed not by things we heard in the media, but by the things we learned together in groups of communities with fellow citizens, learning from one another, challenging one another, listening to one another. Imagine if politicians defined democracy not as putting their name on a ballot, but showing up in communities and empowering citizens with the power to create their agendas. Imagine if you got to create their agenda. If we don't do this, if we don't start defining democracy in these ways and going beyond voting and beyond elected representatives, the things that get talked about, the things that get put forward in the public realm will be completely dictated and controlled by those with the most power, resources, and wealth to spit out gross generalizations, false truths, sound bites, and a politics of fear and division. Does that sound familiar? So to go back to the question I posed at the start, when you imagine a democratic community, what do you picture? This is what it looks like. Go and find it and start making it awesome. Thank you.